What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and at the end of the video that we did for Ultimate Spider-Man, I asked you guys if you wanted me to make a video basically explaining the character of the Maker, or Ultimate Reed Richards, the evil Reed Richards in Marvel Comics. And a lot of you guys said yes. So this video is really more aimed at those of you who don't know anything about the Maker and just kind of want to understand what's going on with this character and how it ties into what's happening right now with the new Ultimate Universe that Marvel Comics has. So kind of going with that theme, the Maker originally appeared in the Ultimate Fantastic Four #1, and he showed up in 2004. The reason why that matters is because the Ultimate Universe was originally Earth 1610, and that one debuted in 2000, which was initially kicked off with Spider-Man, but it was kind of an answer to the question, what would it look like if superheroes at that point in time were showing up for the very first time? So in effect, it was really just more of like an updated and modern take on the Marvel Universe as it was originally created by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby. And so there were big differences that were established with Ultimate Reed Richards versus like his main Marvel Universe counterpart, in the sense that there were similarities. Of course, they were both kind of socially awkward and that they were both obsessed with science. The difference is that the Ultimate Universe version of Reed was heavily abused by his father. And so what that meant was that as he sort of grew and became at least some version of Reed, he kind of just became more and more distant, not just from his father, but also from society at large. Because in addition to the abuse that he was experiencing at home, he was also being bullied by kids at school. And so through all this process, he ended up coming across Ben Grimm, who just kind of helped him navigate, life as it existed for him at that point in time. But this sort of laid the groundwork for everything that would lead to him becoming who he was, and really even becoming a villain in a lot of ways. Of course, a lot of that also comes from Susan Storm. But if any of you guys ever saw that terrible Fan Four Stick film back in the day, the initial origin of Reed is not that far off from the Ultimate Universe. It's relatively accurate, right? Which is one of the reasons why the only good part of that movie is like the first 45 minutes of it. But of course, Reed basically ends up joining essentially a think tank that's led by Dr. Franklin Storm. Now, Dr. Franklin Storm, as you can imagine, is basically the father of Susan Storm and Johnny Storm, who would go on to become members of the Fantastic Four. And for a large chunk of time in the Ultimate Universe, right, as far as that in-universe history goes, it was really just Reed Richards kind of trying to find a way to access what was called the End Zone. Now, the End Zone was based on the Negative Zone in Marvel Comics, and for those of you guys who don't know what that is, as most of you guys know, there's a multiverse, right, like an endless number of universes. There's only one negative zone throughout the whole multiverse, and it can be accessed by any universe. In fact, there have been stories where characters from alternate realities have actually met each other in the negative zone when otherwise they never would have. What Marvel tried to do with the original Ultimate Fantastic Four is they tried to establish that every universe had its own version of the negative zone. This was largely rejected by fans because honestly, it just made things overly confusing. And so later on, Marvel just said the End Zone is the same thing as the negative zone. But Reed had discovered it for the very first time and was trying to find a way to like explore it essentially. That tied in very heavily to the original main Marvel Universe, Mr. Fantastic, right? That Reed Richards that was just exploring the negative zone and everything therein and, all that kind of cool stuff. But this coincided with his encounter with the Ultimate Universe version of what would become Doctor Doom. And much like you would expect with, Doctor Doom and Reed and the Ultimate Universe, that they ultimately developed a kind of rivalry between each other. And so initially it was based on respect, but of course their paths ultimately led them down separate roads. And sticking with Reed here, not focusing too far on the idea of Doctor Doom, there was a point where instead of it being like the Fantastic Four, so Reed and Susan and Johnny and Ben flying into space, being hit with cosmic rays and gaining their powers like in the main Marvel Universe, there came a point when they finally finished their ability to basically transmit data and even like sentient life into the End Zone. What ended up happening is that Doctor Doom basically screwed with their experiment, and that's how they developed powers in Marvel Comics. And then from there, they were just kind of trying to figure out exactly how it was they were going to function or what it was they were going to do. Eventually, they just kind of take on the role of becoming the Fantastic Four. And in fact, in issue number 21, there was a point where Marvel toyed with the idea of Reed Richards in the Ultimate Universe meeting his main Marvel Universe counterpart, because what he got was this kind of image where it was like, hey, this is the life that you could have in this alternate reality, where you're married to Susan, you have a son, all that kind of stuff. Ultimately, it tied into what was basically the Marvel Zombies universe, right? But the fact is that it was just kind of this little bit of experimentation regarding the team over the course of its publication history in Marvel. But quick, fast, and in a hurry, what Marvel did is they introduced an event called Ultimatum. Now, Ultimatum was more of an X-Men centric event than anything else, in the sense that it was basically Magneto using Thor's hammer to launch an attack against the city of New York, specifically launching like a giant tidal wave, flipping the poles, different things like that. But it also kind of back-ended the origin of mutants in the Ultimate Universe, providing an explanation for how they came to exist in the first place. But it also brought the relationship between the Maker and Susan to a head in the Requiem Fantastic Four comic from Ultimatum. Because one of the things that had been established over the course of this was that, yes, Susan and Reed were together as a couple, but it was very, very strained. And in fact, it was largely pulling a lot of things from what would become Jonathan Hickman's Fantastic Four run. Now, how much of Hickman's run was influenced by the Ultimate Fantastic Four versus how much of the Ultimate Fantastic Four were influenced by his run is up for debate. But the fact that we're talking about Ultimatum being launched around the time that Hickman is doing his Fantastic Four run, it would stand to reason the Ultimate Universe actually influenced his work. The reason why I say that is because if you look at like Reed Richards' Fantastic Four from like the main Marvel Universe, that Susan always stuck by Reed's side, even when he was becoming incredibly distant and getting caught up in his scientific work, which was basically trying to solve the problem of everything. Now, Reed Richards just kind of being distant from the Fantastic Four while he focuses on his work, that was hardly a Jonathan Hickman creation, right? That had been a core part of his character for a number of years. It was simply just during Hickman's run that it seemed like it was all coming to a head. Well, in the Ultimate Universe, it did. In fact, it created a massive rift between Reed Richards and Susan Storm. This happened during Ultimatum, and this is where you really start to see the beginnings of Reed Richards becoming the Maker in the Ultimate Universe. Because what happens is there comes a point when he proposes to Susan Storm. Then what was called the Ultimatum wave hit, which was basically the attack on New York, and then he took off and left Susan by herself in order to get out there and deal with the threat of Magneto and the various threats that were out there in order to save the world. And that's really where Susan Storm chose to just call off the engagement, because what she had realized over time is that she would always play fiddle to like Reed Richards' desire to be logical, that he couldn't really put the love between the two of them above his need to fix the world or deal with that threat or deal with this threat or focus on the logic of science and different things like that. And so ultimately she just kind of walked away. Now, this was also something that coincided with the death of her father during Ultimatum, and so Susan Storm's character was presented to us in Fantastic Four Requiem as a character who was just dealing with like a lot of emotional upheaval. And so it just kind of made sense contextually that she would walk away from Reed. Now, what this did is it led into the Ultimate Enemy trilogy, which was actually kind of a story that was a wraparound to the events that were ongoing in the Ultimate Fantastic Four comics at the time, in the sense that in issue number 30, King the Conqueror in the Ultimate Universe showed up to the modern day and then told Reed the world's going to end. And so this basically went into Ultimate Enemy in the sense that somebody started launching attacks against the superhero population, at least what passed for an organized superhero population given the aftermath of Ultimatum, really when the superhero community was seemingly at its weakest. Nobody really understood what was going on, but by the time you got to Ultimate Doom, you actually figured out it was Reed Richards himself. Now, it is important to specify here that leading up to Ultimate Enemy, Reed had faked his death, so there was no reason for anyone to believe that he was the one behind everything. Eventually, Susan Storm figures it out, and when she realizes that he had faked his death and the fact that other people had been harmed as a result of his actions, she goes to attack him. And this was Brian Michael Bendis, who was writing the Ultimate Enemy trilogy at the time, basically establishing there would be no reconciliation between Reed and Susan. Seemingly that wouldn't be the case. And in fact, it was actually designed to basically end with the death of Reed Richards, right? He was going to be written out of the Ultimate Universe seemingly forever. And the way this played out was that when Susan Storm went to attack Reed, he almost killed her, right? And so because of that, he ended up basically escaping into the negative zone itself. And then the rest of the superheroes followed suit. And what followed was a massive conflict between Reed Richards and his forces going against the various superheroes and the Fantastic Four. And so ultimately, Reed Richards was just basically left out there in the negative zone after having his face burned by Johnny Storm and his entire left side paralyzed. And so there was no real reason to expect his character to return. And the story literally ended that way. It was like, so passes Reed, metaphorically. And like, that was essentially it. Then you go into Jonathan Hickman's Ultimates. And this is when you get the Maker as you know him. Because what happens is that Reed Richards eventually shows back up. And what he does is he creates something called the Children of Tomorrow, and he creates what's called the Dome, or the city. as some people refer to it. This is what you saw if you were reading Jonathan Hickman's Avengers and New Avengers and the events leading up to Secret Wars 2015, in the sense that what Reed had done here in designing the city or the dome, that he had basically constructed it in a way that time would pass differently, meaning time passed faster inside the dome. What it did is it kind of wrapped back around and tied into the kind of premonition from Kang in the Ultimate Universe, which actually turned out to be Susan Storm from the future, and like this sort of premonition that like Earth was going to be destroyed, right? So it was essentially the Maker's way of trying to fast track human evolution and creating essentially superhumans or metahumans to a degree, and then using those as a way to save the Earth if anything ever were to happen. The reality here is he was largely using it for his own personal desires, right? In a way to kind of conquer the world, bring peace to the world, and bring it under his control. One of the downsides here about Reed Richards as a Maker is that initially he was just a guy who just did like villainous stuff. But after that, you go into a story called Ultimates Disassembled. This is really more just Reed Richards operating on behalf of Kang more than anything else, but it's not overly important regarding like the evolution or the history of him becoming the Maker. It was just him doing stuff as a villain, essentially, in the Ultimate Universe. But then that goes into Cataclysm. Now, Cataclysm was a significant story because that was actually kind of building up to the events of Secret Wars 2015 as part of what Jonathan Hickman was writing as part of the multiversal collapse, essentially. Technically, Cataclysm dealt more with the Age of Ultron event in the main Marvel Universe, in the sense that there came a point in that story when like Wolverine kept jumping back and forth through time and literally broke time. And so what it did is it teleported Galactus from the main Marvel Universe to the Ultimate Universe. And in the Ultimate Universe, the main version of Galactus merged with the Ultimate Universe version of himself and created this pretty dope looking counterpart. Ultimately ended up leading to Galactus essentially being like sent away to the negative zone and Earth was saved. But then you go into Time Runs Out. And all Time Runs Out did was, again, because it was all kind of written by Jonathan Hickman, he came back to the character of the Maker and had it established that the Maker was working alongside Nick Fury to kind of help rebuild S.H.I.E.L.D. in the aftermath of S.H.I.E.L.D.'s destruction. But during this time, the Maker had ended up discovering that the incursions were happening. Now, truth to tell, within Hickman's run, we don't really find out how he learned about it. We simply just know that he did. But unlike the main Marvel Universe Reed and the Illuminati, who hesitantly destroyed worlds, but ultimately chose not to if they didn't have to, the Maker actually did it willingly. And he destroyed something like 66 or 67 worlds or something like that. Like, it was nuts how many Earths he annihilated. Because for him, it was all about practical precision, right? It was all about logistics and what made the most logical sense. And that was really the core of the Maker at this point in time, is that any real shred of empathy or humanity that he had left was effectively gone, right? That there was only ever just the logical decision. So sure, he was like a human being walking around Earth, but it was more like he was almost a robot, right? In terms of how he like saw things and how he operated. But what Hickman also did is he drew massive parallels between the main Marvel Universe Reed Richards and the Maker, in the sense that what ended up happening is the Maker actually started creating a kind of bridge that allowed him to see into alternate realities in the same way that the main Marvel Universe Reed Richards did. And so all these roads and themes kind of converged together in Jonathan Hickman's Avengers and New Avengers run in two forms. The first was that during Hickman's Avengers run, when Black Panther and Black Bolt of the Inhumans, which I don't understand why Black Panther would bring Black Bolt with him, that guy sucks. When they left Namor the Submariner for dead on like an alternate world alongside the Cabal, that it was believed that they were going to be destroyed. Instead, what ended up happening is the Cabal and Namor jumped from that Earth as it was basically experiencing an incursion with the Ultimate Universe. So to kind of create this leap here, they went from the main Marvel Universe to a random universe to the Ultimate Universe, where they encountered the Maker. And so the Maker, realizing that the Cabal was capable of destroying alternate worlds with ruthless aggression, actually decided to start working alongside them. So basically it was the Maker, Thanos, the Black Order, and Namor the Submariner. What this also did is it built on an event, or at least a circumstance, that happened in Cataclysm, where the Maker had traveled to the main Marvel Universe in order to understand the nature of Galactus before, of course, they defeated Galactus. When he arrived in the main Marvel Universe, he learned about the main Marvel Universe Reed, his life and all that kind of stuff. And so that sort of bookends into Secret Wars 2015 when you effectively have the final two incursions, in the sense that the Ultimate Universe and the main Marvel Universe are about to crash into each other. And so it's actually the Maker who goads Nick Fury into attacking the main Marvel Universe and trying to annihilate all the superheroes and destroy that world. Now, of course, as we know from Secret Wars 2015, none of it really worked. They crashed into each other, and then you get Secret Wars. But that's how it is that the Maker and Reed become aware of each other. The Maker already knew about Reed, technically, because he had traveled to the main Marvel Universe and learned about his life. And over the course of Secret Wars 2015, it's really just kind of the Maker allying himself with Thanos, but also sort of doing his own thing. And then, as we know from Secret Wars 2015, that Reed Richards takes the power of the Beyonders and starts recreating everything. Now, here's where things get confusing for the average person when it comes to the Maker. What Marvel did is, for quite some time, specifically with like New Avengers and things like that, the Maker existed in the main Marvel Universe, but he was free-floating. He just didn't really have a purpose. He was just kind of there, and like you saw him, and like he did some things, but none of it really mattered. I mean, there was the Eternity War story arc, but it's not nearly as cool as you think it was. What is important is that there was something called Project Oversight. Now, Project Oversight was basically this idea that the Maker had met back up with the Council of Reeds, which was initially introduced in Jonathan Hickman's Fantastic Four run, and literally exactly what it sounds like, a Council of Reed Richards from alternate realities. And the Maker was kind of given this promise that if he would carry out their campaigns, he'd be given the ability to essentially recreate or restore the Ultimate Universe and then conquer it. And so what Marvel was doing during this time is they were toying with the idea of restoring the original Ultimate Universe. Reed Richards did exactly that, or the Maker rather, did exactly that. And in fact, that carried through into things like Absolute Carnage, going into the King of Black, and things along those lines. So much so that in Venom Beyond by Donny Cates, there's actually a point where the Maker is transported back to the Ultimate Universe and presumably begins the process of conquering it. What ended up happening is all this got done away with. Right? Like it was all basically wiped out and it was destroyed. And we don't really know how, right? We just kind of know it was sort of a hand-wavy thing where seemingly Marvel just pretends that it doesn't exist. There is some measure of explanation that's offered in Venom issue number 35, but ultimately it doesn't offer any real explanation at all. And so what I usually tell people is that any and everything that you saw regarding the Maker between the end of Secret Wars 2015 and the beginning of the Ultimate Universe miniseries that just recently launched by Jonathan Hickman, you can ignore. You can just pretend like none of it ever happened. And so what Hickman did is he came back, and by wiping all of that stuff out, because what Hickman does in the Ultimate Universe miniseries is he picks up with the Maker basically being held prisoner, and that what the Maker had been doing was systematically brainwashing therapists into basically getting him the tools he needed in order to orchestrate his own escape, which is exactly what he does. Following that, he starts jumping around, stealing little bits of technology here and there, and then he travels into the multiverse, and instead of going to Earth 1610, which again has more or less just kind of been removed from Marvel canon, he travels to a universe called Earth 6160, which is what's happening right now. Now this again is kind of where the confusion sets in. Earth 6160 is almost identical to Earth 616. There were a few changes here and there, but ultimately we don't really know what it looked like in its most pure form, because by the time we picked up with it, what the Maker had done is on this world he had developed a time travel device called the Immortus Engine. And then after using information he had gathered about the Earth superheroes from the Illuminati in the main Marvel Universe, he basically just kind of used logic to trace out how this universe would most likely unfold as the various heroes began to manifest. Peter Parker being bitten by a radioactive spider, Thor arriving on Earth for whatever reason, Bruce Banner becoming the Incredible Hulk, and Captain America being frozen in a block of ice and eventually thawed out. And so what he did is he constructed a kind of list of the most important people to take out. It was effectively a hit list. It wasn't really a kill list per se. Instead, it was just altering events over the course of time to ensure that things didn't happen. And because he had disrupted the time stream so much, there was no real way to know what kind of changes he had made. And so that's what's happening right now in the Earth 6160 universe. That what you have here is you had the Maker who formed a kind of Illuminati, where where they basically control the world behind the scenes, and then he controlled the Illuminati. Ultimately, the Maker was defeated inside the city, and because time passed differently in the dome, which he had rebuilt in this universe, that he's just stuck there for something like 18 months or 2 years or something along those lines, and we're literally just waiting in the comics for like the dome to reopen to see what comes out of it. We have no idea what's going to take place. But by and large, the story just focuses on Peter Parker, who's just now becoming Spider-Man after all this time. And Tony Stark himself is actually in the future, that it was Howard Stark who was the first Iron Man, not Tony. And that after the death of Howard, that Tony was blamed for the attack, that the Illuminati had literally used a Stark satellite to attack the city of New York. And because it was believed to be Tony, he ended up fleeing into the future alongside Doctor Doom, who in this universe was that reality's version of Reed. And what the Maker did is he tortured that version of Reed in order to convince that version of Reed that he's actually Doctor Doom, and then basically killed the Fantastic Four and different things like that. So it's kind of nuts. It was the Maker who killed the Fantastic Four, not Doom. I don't want to confuse you guys in that way. But again, we're still very, very early into the development of this Ultimate Universe, right? I mean, Spider-Man is on issue number 9, the Ultimate X-Men I think are on issue number 7, Black Panther's on like issue number 8 or something along those lines. So again, we're fresh off the docks when it comes to this thing. So not a whole lot of catch up for you to do if you decide you want to get into it by checking out this playlist and getting caught up with the videos that we've done, or else going to read it yourself. But with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this to an end. Hopefully it all makes sense, gives you enough context to understand what's going on with the Maker in Marvel. If you have any other questions, feel free to post them down in the comments section. I'll answer them as best I can, or somebody else will answer them for me if they beat me to the punch. And I will catch you all later. Peace.